Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's BIOMES seminar. My name is Nandini Arora, and I'm a second-year MEM and one of the student committee members for BIOMES. For those of you who are new here, BIOMES is our weekly webinar series, and like most things at YSE, is an acronym for Bridging Issues and Optimizing Methods in Environmental Studies. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Adrian Cerezo. Dr. Cerezo is a visiting researcher and child project fellow at the Yale Child Study Center and a research fellow at the University of Maine. Recently, he was appointed as a global visiting faculty at Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey, Mexico. His transdisciplinary work explores the fundamental role of early childhood development in achieving community resilience and global sustainable development. He holds a PhD and MESc from Yale University with a focus on social ecology, child development, complex systems, and global policy, as well as over 25 years of field experience in environmental and community-based education. He currently serves as Senior Advisor on Early Childhood Development and Climate Change to the Asia-Pacific Regional Network for Early Childhood, UNICEF Pacific, and the Early Childhood Development Action Network. Since 2007, he has participated in the climate negotiations and has been a member for the delegation for the Republic of Marshall Islands since 2022. We do have spots open for dinner with him tonight if you want to continue conversations with him. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cerezo.
This is so cool. I got free pizza again after so many years, and I didn't get any pizza fat on my shirt. So that's all a step in the right direction. It is such an honor to be here. I did a lecture, the Grand Rounds lecture last year at the School of Medicine because my PhD is sort of a shared degree between the Child Study Center and the School of Forestry, what you now call the School of the Environment. And some students were interested in sort of crossing the bridge and doing the School of the Environment version of this presentation. So that's what I'm going to do today. As you saw or not in the advertisement, I decided to go with the flow and focus on and use acorns as a metaphor. But the gist of this presentation and what we're going to be talking about today is the idea that the nurturing care of the youngest children, and by that I mean the children that are 0 to 3 years of age, is an emerging tool set to address the global challenges of sustainable development. And to discuss that, I am going to first give you an introduction to early childhood development because I am guessing this is a topic that you're not necessarily familiar with, and it's an emerging, growing topic for ourselves. So I want to catch you up on the state of knowledge in the field, but I am going to use the metaphor of acorns because why not? Here we are, and then I'm going to talk about how all of this is connected to sustainable development, which is my area of global policy research. And then we're going to talk about how do we make that happen, like how do we get that benefit from early childhood development. And then I'm going to tell you the story of how we are putting it to practice in, turns out, many countries that eat breadfruit. So moving from acorns to breadfruit. And then I'm going to tell you about the future of what we're doing. And finally, I'm going to get back to acorns, but I'm really going to be talking about a little bit about my time here at FES, what I learned, and some lessons that I think might be useful for you or not. So, you know, a mouthful, but hopefully we'll get it done in enough time to handle a few questions as well. So let's start with a few key concepts on early childhood development. Well, the first is the very most obvious thing, that early childhood development is the earliest moment in life. The less obvious part about that is that research shows that that moment, as related to the impacts it's going to have throughout your lifespan, actually begins in the adolescence of your parents. There are studies that show that women that experience depression during their teen years carry that depression over in chemical signals that get reported in statistically significant issues with some children. So even at that moment, we're talking about early childhood development. And the longest definition of early childhood goes all the way to 7 to 9 years to what we call transition to formal schooling. But most of the research that I do is 0 to 3, and we deliberately use the word 0 to 3 because 0 is kind of like a moving target, and it also helps us avoid the discussion about abortion, which is kind of a complicated topic in the United States. Because most of the return on investment is garnered between 0 to 3 years of age. So the first 1,000 days. It is also important and more relevant to our school that ECD is a complex nonlinear network / system, okay? And this is a description that Alan Fogel did that I find very useful because what we call the baby is really the expression of what he describes as the intrapersonal, which is what's inside the baby, like from the skin inward. The interpersonal, which is the closest family relationships. The ecological, which is, the sociocultural, which is everything else that has to do with human-based culture and ecosystems and systems. And then the ecological, which is everything. And this is really important because for the work that I do on climate change and early childhood development and sustainable development and early childhood development, it is really important to emphasize that construct of the child or the baby is really this. And the success of the baby is tied to the success of this. And we're finding that conversely, the success of this network is tied to the success of the baby, and that's what we work on policy-wise. From a more programmatic, policy-related perspective, we also know that the success of the network requires comprehensive nurturing care. And you will hear this term a few times while we're talking today, because there is this thing called the nurturing care framework that was put together as the global policy answer to governments that say, wow, this is great. How do we take care of young children? And the WHO, UNICEF, and 10 more organizations got together and they said, well, if nothing else, you need to take care of these 5 things at the same time: health, nutrition, parental care, safety and security, and opportunities for learning. If any of you here are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, you're already starting to see points of like this Venn diagram of one thing and the other connecting, hopefully. It's also a period with immediate and lifelong returns on investment. And James Heckman won the Nobel Prize in Economics for the work he did on the monetary return on investment in early childhood development. And I am new to economics, but I love this curve. And this is like the curve that we use in global early childhood development policy because it shows that most of that return happens at the very beginning of life. And then it shows that it precipitously drops down, and the R line, the line where it stops being returns on that investment happens around the moment where early childhood development ends, 7 to 9 years of age. After that, obviously, we don't throw people in the trash. I mean, we don't. Some other people do, but that's another matter. It only says that you can address these issues that are going to arise, but it will be more costly, it will take longer, and it's more likely to fail. Whereas if you attend to them in a proactive way, you can expect a return of between $9 and $12 for dollars spent at the early moment development in life. This is something that I need to talk about specifically here because of something that was told to me by an environmental and climate economist in one of my visits to the climate conference. She famously said, dead children have no carbon footprint. Because we are advocating for caring for children, and she's like, dead kids are not a problem to us. I know, sounds pretty awful. So I did a little bit of reading, and that would be great, except that for the first beginning of us being humans, up to 150 years ago, 30 to 40% of all children did in fact die before 5 years of age. That was the reality of demographics. You would lose 30 to 40% of all people between 0 and 5 years of age. But currently in the United States, globally, that percentage is 0.037% globally. In the United States, it's 0.0065%. It's a statistical anomaly. There is a lot of talk about maternal mortality in the United States and child mortality in the United States, but it's not because it's a huge problem. It's because it's a clustered problem around poverty and exclusion. Anyway, here's the important part. So why do we have that there? Because the statistics show, in work that was published in the Lancet a couple of years ago, that while that is the case, that many less children are dying, 30 to 40% of children are experiencing some form of neglect, abuse, malnutrition, or severe enough problem that will set a trajectory for a pathway to vulnerability for the rest of their lives. So now we're not talking about mortality, which is the illusion that, like that fantasy we have when we're talking about environment, climate change, and children. They're going to die. We're talking about quality of life, and we're talking about potential. And in the context of climate change, we're talking about climate carbon footprints, which is kind of interesting. And I'm going to tell you about the work that I'm doing more recently on calculating the carbon footprint over a lifespan of a person, depending on the care they receive in early childhood. And I was surprised with what I found out. So hopefully this is interesting to you. So again, a trajectory of potential or a trajectory of risk or vulnerability in many areas that are normally unknown for most people in areas of policy that are not specifically early childhood development. I spend a lot of time talking about that little cluster that looks like grapes. That is the thymus gland. And if you don't know the thymus gland, you should know the thymus gland, especially if you're interested in early childhood development, because the thymus gland is sort of like the architect of our immune system. And it does most of its work when we are babies. It sort of polls the environment, and it keeps polling the environment and deciding these are the antibodies, the sets of antibodies that we are going to need. But because the body is consistently trying to be efficient, one thing that happens to the thymus gland is that it starts reducing and dissipating. And by the time you're a teen, it is tiny compared to the thymus gland that you have when you're a baby. So whatever didn't get addressed when you were a baby probably doesn't get addressed. And as it is for that, it is for weird stuff like children that spend most of their time inside spaces where they can't see more than 18 feet in distance, they tend to have myopia. And the American Academy of Ophthalmologists did a study. Now Singapore has a policy, for example, where they are asking parents to have children outside so that they can see further at least 2 hours a day, whatever they're doing. They could be doing their homework, but being outside has created the conditions for a reduction in myopia in Singapore. So very big things with very big implications. Social emotional development and our relationship to nature is strongly determined by the kinds of events that happen here early in life. And many of you who are here probably begin your life history with, I do this because when I was little, somebody brought me outside a lot, or I went to the Natural History Museum a lot, or I spent time climbing trees, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or the other side of the coin, I lived in a place that was, I was going to say a shithole, but I don't think I'm allowed to say that. So, and there was a lot of pollution, and I decided to make it a priority to make sure nobody experiences that. So these things gets settled, and the identity that is tied to it gets settled early in life. Same thing happens with the process of epigenetics. And this means things that are close to genes, but not the genes. And it is a challenging idea for people that think that genetics is sort of like a written in stone kind of situation, that you're born with the genes that you have, and that's what you have, and you don't complain. Sort of you get what you get and you don't get upset. But the truth is that the genetic expression of the body is sort of like a multiple choice test. And depending on the exposures that you have in the environment, you're going to, your body chemically is going to decide to express certain genes and not other genes. A lot of that happens in early childhood, especially in the first 3 years of life. As related to neurological development, 2/5 of the brain develop after you're born. I tell my friends that babies are born half baked, and 3/5 baked. And the reason that is happening is because, again, we have an evolutionary tendency to be efficient and to generate the brain that we need rather than any brain that we can have, because the brain is very energetically expensive. And so that happens, and the brain develops all of these synapses, synaptic connections, like a lot of them. It's called the synaptic explosion, and there's a lot of them. And then there is something called pruning that happens around 5 years of age. And when pruning happens, what the brain does is that it dissipates the synaptic connections that have not been used a lot. And after that, there is a little explosion when you're a teen, and there is a tiny explosion when you're around 21. But the biggest construction of the architecture of our neural system happens when you're a baby. Finally, it is also a pathway to peace or trauma. And there is a lot of work that is being done on the impact of multi-generational trauma. So I'll focus on that right now, and stunting. And all of those things are not things that have significance over the lifespan of one human being. They have significance over the lifespan of generations. There is work being done right now, for instance, on people who experienced the Holocaust as survivors, and how that altered their genetic makeup, and how that altered genetic makeup is being transferred 2 generations down to their grandchildren. So we're talking about events that have significance not only in the lifespan of a person, but now set the stage for changes in communities as well. So nurturing care leads to potential resilience and sustainability, and we have over 50 years of evidence in that direction. And inaction leads to vulnerability and risk. So let's get to the second part of the story. And for this, you're about to see slides that I use when I talk to heads of states when we're talking about this connection between early childhood development and climate change and sustainable development. So think of the baby now as this acorn, as this seed. And again, in my mind, the baby is all of that. It's not. So in any circumstance, for any baby, in any part of the world, there will be a series of things raining down on them, a series of issues that can create vulnerability, whether it is vector-borne diseases, pollution, mental health problems, learning disabilities, forced migration, physical disabilities, exclusion, etc. And if we don't attend to that, all things being equal, if we don't do anything about that, all of those things are going to contribute to a person a baby that is weak, that has heightened vulnerabilities, leading to a life of heightened vulnerability over the lifespan, where the person will most likely not be able to deliver on their promise and the fruits that they can share with the community. Now, bring into play the nurturing care framework and do for this seed like we do for real seeds, where you fortify them, or you protect them, or you use antifungals, or you do all sorts of either awful things or appropriate organic things to make sure that the seeds do well. And now the roots of that seed are going to be much stronger, and it's going to be a much stronger tree. And you get the first return on that investment, which is the well-being and the potential of that individual is protected, and it's expressed to themselves and to their community. So that's sort of the normal world as it was. A trickle of risk and et cetera, et cetera. But we don't live in the normal world anymore. And the things that used to be a trickle are now a storm, because climate change is exacerbating the risk and the vulnerabilities for young children, and that has been widely studied. So now we need to protect that seed in a different way. We need to consider the nurturing care framework, but we also need to keep in mind the Sustainable Development Goals as guidance of thinking of what do we want to do in early childhood development. And one of the things that we have found, and this is some of the things that I'm getting ready to publish in a series of papers now, is that you get a different kind of fruit. You get all of the fruits that you would have gotten to your community by protecting the potential and the capacity of a person, plus a return as sustainable development. It's like rocket boosting sustainable development. And from the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, this kind of conscious protection or support of early childhood development delivers directly about 10 of the 17, indirectly all 17, well, 16 except for the throwaway, which is SDG 17 that has to do with getting together and making them happen. So that's the second return on investment, rocket boosting sustainable development. And then in the context of climate change, which is one of the sustainable development goals, you get this third return on investment that is of a lot of interest, especially to vulnerable countries like the Marshall Islands and the Pacific region, where I work directly with the governments. And so let me explain this a little bit, or just recap this a little bit. Investing in that seed generates children that do better, and in doing better, they have a lower carbon footprint. And investing in sustainable development, mindful of early childhood development, delivers communities, urban areas, and societies that are more beneficial to young children, and therefore we capture more of that carbon reduction impact of early childhood development. Very rough estimates that we're doing on how much that is suggest that it could be about half to 1 gigaton over 50 years per year. This is significant enough to be equivalent to a yearly reduction of the carbon footprint of Japan. Just to give you an idea, this is not an insignificant amount of reduction, but the great thing about it is that the same money that you use to do this, you also use, it's the same money, gives you people that do better, and it gives you a higher degree, a higher success of the Sustainable Development Goals. So policies and programs focused on early years provide a cost-effective, comprehensive, immediate, and enduring path to achieving human potential and well-being, boosting sustainable development, and helping us with climate action. But of course, this is all conceptual, so we have been looking at how do we turn that into action. And there is a paper in The Lancet that was published 5 years ago that looks specifically at that question. How do you turn these concepts into policy that are effectively transforming communities and societies? And not surprisingly, it begins with adequate financing. But it's adequate financing not just so that we have a bunch of money. It's adequate financing because the programs that are successful have high quality, they are equitably distributed, and they are timely in delivery and duration. Early childhood development programs have to be delivered at the right time. Now that there is so much talk about vaccines in the United States, it's of no use to give you a vaccine when you're 5 after you have gone through all sorts of awful things, it has to be done at the right time. And certain programs and certain approaches to care have to be done with the right duration. It cannot be one-off. It cannot be one day. Some of them have to be 1 month. Some of them have to be 1 year. Some of them have to be 5 years. We need to have the financing available to support the right duration of those programs. Based on my own work, I have found that the other measure of success of these programs is that they become ever more entangled with environmental and sustainability principles and environmental and sustainable development science, because that way we garner the most benefit from these programs and the most correspondence between the things that are being done for young children and the things that are being done in agriculture, commerce, employment, security, etc. So for early childhood to deliver on its promise of a sustainable future, programs must be well-financed, comprehensive, high quality, equitable, delivered at the right time and for the right duration, and be in alignment with climate and sustainable development knowledge. A lot of the work that we're currently doing right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, is built on the idea that it's time to build stronger intersectoral collaborations with environmental, wildlife, and sustainable development institutions. The way that I explain it to my colleagues in early childhood development is that we need to turn early childhood into a grown-up policy matter. Because for the longest time, early childhood development has been considered the work of first ladies. And this is nothing against first ladies, but they are not the people who build policy in countries. They're the people who do charity in countries. This is not charity work. This is the fundamental cross-cutting building tool of a sustainable future for countries, and they need to be considered that way, and we need to come into the world that way, so as grown-up policy makers, so that we can be addressing this with the seriousness it requires. Okay, so now let's talk about this in actual practice, not in theoretic practice. So the work that I've been doing since 2022, which is then the last iteration, the latest iteration of the work I've been doing in global policy, is mostly in the Pacific region, because the Pacific region, it was sort of a confluence of things. I had been working with UNICEF at that point for several years, and there was this meeting to put together the Pacific Regional Council for Early Childhood Development that called for 9 action points. And they had a meeting, and obviously everybody's in a very, very focused on climate change in the Pacific region. So they invited me because I was the climate guy in ECD. And I gave a presentation, and out of that presentation, several things happened. This PRC for ECD got modified, and they added an action point. And I added the text to the action point here because this is, if you don't remember anything else today, you need to remember this formulation. This is not about doing preschool education about climate change. That is nonsense. It's also pedagogically inappropriate, and I also think that it is torture. So no, this is about ECD as a pathway to increase the resilience and adaptive capacity of communities to the effect of climate change. We take care of children, we get resilient communities. Because when we take care of the baby, what we're taking care of really is that network. And when we take care of that network in a way that focuses on the value of early childhood development, you get more resilient communities. And other emergencies and the action point says, let's promote collaborations between the areas of ECD and natural resources, environment, and sustainable development. The Marshall Islands, which is the country that I am a member of delegation for the COP, immediately took this on. They understood that here was something that was of great value to a country that had a really high level of problems in early childhood development, a really high level of problems in sustainable development, and certainly an existential problem with climate change. Those 4 documents are 4 documents that have now instituted as part of national policy the entanglement of early childhood development and climate change. The first one is the National Policy on Early Childhood Development, which, okay, because I wrote it, so not the whole thing, just the part on climate. So it has a good long section on climate that reflects that idea. We do better by babies, we have more resilient communities, and it is a pathway to climate adaptation. The second one, though, is the climate NDC for Marshall Islands, and it has a paragraph on early childhood development as an area of priority. Not children in general, but early childhood development policy as a building block of more resilient communities. Then there was a recent meeting of women and gender-related policy in the Pacific, and their outcome document includes early childhood development. And so that's the last one here. And this, the third one, is actually the government statement for their plan for the whole country. And that includes now early childhood development as a priority. We're currently working, and it's not there because it's not finished, on including early childhood development as part of the costing plan for the adaptation plan for the Marshall Islands. Also, with the support of the Marshall Islands, I was a speaker at the first ever expert dialogue convened by the UNFCCC on children and climate change. And everybody, and it was 7 hours and 50 minutes of people saying, oh my God, this is horrible. All the children are going to die. You should be really worried. The world is catching on fire, et cetera, et cetera. And then 10 minutes of me saying, but if you invest in young children, you don't only get those young children to do better, but you actually reduce your carbon footprint and you do better in terms of climate resilience and you do better in terms of sustainable development. So more countries took this up. And now we have, all of those countries in the Pacific region have instituted some form of connection between early childhood development and climate change in their early childhood development policy and in their climate policy, in some version and in some way. The Dominican Republic is doing the same. Colombia is in discussions to do the same. I am currently working very closely with Mexico, and we're moving in that direction. And this is kind of important because as we're talking about the future, one of the things that we're doing prospectively is kind of an odd thing because I've been going to COP since 2007, and I've been going to COP as a delegate since 2023. And my job is kind of funny because everybody thinks that you're there to like, you have to save the children, blah, blah, blah. And I don't do that. I kind of exist in the borders of the conference just to use the time to get to know people that might be interested in this work. Because the real work that I do is at the national level, where we get countries to discuss how can we get their national governments to elevate the issue of early childhood development. Why? Because at the COP level, there is no bandwidth anymore to talk about including one more topic in the Green Climate Fund or one more topic in the conference or a new constituency of babies, which would be hilarious and very cute, but not really helpful. So we don't try to do that, and by guidance provided by both Marshall Islands, AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States, and the Dominican Republic, what we're really doing is trying to find new champion countries to do this at the national level, and then work with the organizations like the Rogues Gallery of people involved in early childhood development, UNICEF, World Vision, Save the Children, et cetera, to get them to ramp down their pressure on the conference and to tell the conference we're going to support the parties in the movement towards a new architecture of financing, which is really what's going to unlock national financing of truly innovative ways of addressing climate change. So it's a really odd work. I'm heading to COP30 with the Marshallese delegation. I'm going to be doing that and what I just described, and trying to do more work on getting more countries involved at the national level. We suspect that what's going to happen is that there's going to be a moment of critical mass, and then it will be brought back to the COP conference. But I have very good conferences because whether I win or lose, I always win if I get to know new people and new countries and get introduced to new representatives. But the real prize is the Summit of the Future and the discussions of what's going to happen with the SDGs, because the real prize is not the climate conference. The real prize is, can we get the UN and the parties to understand that early childhood is not a peripheral topic. It is a central, fundamental, cross-cutting topic that should be considered in every one of the SDGs, whatever their new version is going to be. In 2015, we tried to do some advocacy on that, and we didn't get anywhere. And I think now we have enough data and enough support that we can get some substantive consideration of early childhood development, not as the cute topic of the SDGs, but as the place where you put money first, the place where you put the least money with the most return for so many of the areas of sustainable development: gender, water, energy, innovation, employment. All of those things are incredibly tied to early childhood development. We're also building a machine in Mexico. That's part of the work I'm doing in the tech in Monterrey, which is an AI-assisted machine that pretty much uses the same modeling rationale the IPCC uses to do modeling and forecasting for climate change, but it asks a slightly different question, which is, what happens to a community if you consider early childhood development in all of its dimensions? What is scenario A? What is scenario B? What is scenario C? Okay, and we're very early in that work, but we have some promising work on the kind of inquiries that we can put into that machine and the kind of policy impacts that we can bring out of that machine. I'm mentioning this last one here because I think there might be people sitting here that might be interested, or you might have friends that might be interested. We're also working on, it's kind of like a sketch of an idea at this point, but I've been discussing it with some economists and I think it's promising. An idea of extension to carbon credits, where normally carbon credits are very hardware oriented, like here's the tree and you get a carbon credit for that. What we're hoping is that we can get these extended carbon credits that say, here's the tree in a community that has children and families. Can we make a financing package that includes the families and that have young children so that we can really elevate the carbon capturing value of that tree? This is not just about climate. You are in the School of the Environment and you have conceivably taken some classes on environmental history. And you know that we spent the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s trying to cajole, convince, colonize, abuse people into protecting wildlife. And we failed miserably. You can go to Brazil. I don't need to. You can just see the satellite photos. For all the promise, we failed. And why did we fail? Why do we still have a crisis of extinction? Why do we still lose so many acres of forest every day? Because we didn't take seriously that this is a human emergency and it requires taking care of human development. We created the SDGs as the answer to that question. We talked about sustainable development and created this architecture that says we take care of each other and these other things get taken care of, but we keep ignoring it. And carbon credits are built around that same premise, that people are an annoyance in building this like hardware-oriented carbon capturing system. We need to understand that people are a feature of the system and that the complexity is a feature of the system. And if we take care of the people, we can potentially really elevate the value of those carbon capturing and carbon sequestration schemes. And so we're, again, going to be trying that out in the future. We're conceptually working on it. Okay, and now shifting gears a little bit, I'm a graduate from here, and it's no accident that acorns and oak trees are sort of the theme for this presentation. So I wanted to tell you, I mean, I get emotional. Like, I wanted to tell you a few things that I learned while I was here from the people that I learned them. My chair of my dissertation was Steve Keller, and if you don't know him or his work, you should. And he taught me to be unbounded and to be rigorous, but to be unbounded. Never let anybody tell you what is the limit of your field and what is the limit of your inquiry. He wrote books on religion. He was a social ecologist and a biologist. He wrote award-winning books on architecture. The first book on children and nature, that was a study. He wrote the biophilia hypothesis too, after Joe Wilson had written that essay on biophilia. And he collaborated with colleagues to turn that into an actual hypothesis that was looking scientifically about our connection with nature. And nobody, mostly everybody or a lot of people were telling him, yeah, that's not your thing. And he just forged ahead and created new ways of looking at what we do every day. Michael Dove, who's still on faculty here, taught me to be reflective and to be curious, especially when it's inconvenient, to be curious about what am I missing? Not just what is missing in the picture, but what am I not seeing? And what are the things, what are my biases that I'm bringing into the process, and how do we put those biases in front of everybody so that we can clearly show where we stand and what we're talking about. My advisor and the other member of my committee was from the School of Medicine, the Child Study Center, Pia Brito, and she's now the head of education for all of UNICEF Global. And she taught me nothing replaces kindness, rigor and kindness. And finally, Susan Clark, whom you might know or not, and her work on policy sciences that taught me authenticity is important. And if we don't do this to promote freedom and dignity, we're not doing the work. So all of that together brought me to this field, to this new crazy field, of which I was the first person to endeavor, because, and it is a really optimistic take on all of these crazy topics and all of these apocalyptic moment that we're in, because what I've learned is that each child is an opportunity to find our way towards sustainable development. Each one, every child that is born, every moment a new child is born, you have like that moment of resetting the whole system a little bit. And if we take care of each child as they are born, we have an opportunity every time to change that curve from a sink to a source, or from a flat line to a source. And that is, I mean, I get up very excited about my work every day because I get to do that. And if I fail miserably and we only support 10% of children, we're still building that. If we do kind of well by other measures and say we support 50% of children, we're also doing that. So with that, I want to thank you. And I would really love to have a dialogue and take some questions.
Who wants to ask questions? Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's definitely it's a topic that I've not actually thought about a lot. So I think it's really interesting. My focus is on energy systems. So I don't know how relevant it is sort of to my focus, but I want to delve more into this idea of extended carbon credits that you're thinking about. And do you have some sort of early thoughts on like how you would sort of operationalize it in terms of, just sort of, because what carbon credit companies want is sort of like a framework or rigor, and it's definitely easier to do it in like with hardware, as you said. So more thoughts of that. Thank you.
At this point in the process, thank you for the question and thank you for being here. At this point in the process, again, it's more of a sketch of an idea because my field is not economics and it's certainly not carbon credits. I have talked to people actually from Yale and from other climate economists, and it's sort of this conversation like, I have this crazy notion, what do you think about it? And the response has generally been very positive. So again, if any of you are game, I would be more than happy to continue the conversation. I really think that there is money to be made here, and that money is going to lead to a carbon reduction and the protection of. I have an earlier career before I fully devoted my work on this in wildlife conservation and global wildlife conservation policy, and I was the director for education research at the St. Louis Zoo, where I was doing a lot of work globally on, and I got to see the field sites where people were doing conservation of rhinos and all of that stuff. And I mean, I don't do this derisively. I think the people that I was working with were doing this for me. They were the ones that were like, this is all lost, this is very hard, da da da. And I think it is for that as it is for carbon sequestration using schemes that use protected areas, that the protected area is protected as long as the community is taken care of and the community is considered. So that would be the beginning of the conversation. Like, how do we monetize it or structure it so that it's truly an investment rather than just a subsidy or some other form of, but anyway, if you have some thoughts, I am ready to learn from you guys.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Claire, and my mom is an early childhood educator, specifically in nature-related and STEAM initiatives, so I wish she could be here too. I'm just curious about some of the successes within national policies, perhaps in the Pacific region. Like, do those include teacher training, or yeah, what are some of the programs within some of those successful national policies?
How do I say this nicely? No, just kidding. So I don't work with teachers because I work 0 to 3. And like I said, there is this like impulse. It's almost like a gravitational pull. When you talk about early childhood development, people think about two things: childcare and preschools. And none of what I do, I mean, very, very little of what I do has to do with that. That said, the policies in the Marshall Islands do consider teacher training about this, but it is not the same kind of teacher training. That it is really not about curricula for young children about climate change, or even curricula for families about climate change. The premise of all of this is better education leads to better lives, leads to lower carbon footprints. Better education, better preparedness for education leads to better lives, which leads to community resilience. So I don't specifically work with teachers on climate change. We work on education policy as a driver of climate resilience. And that subtlety makes it complicated because again, historically, early childhood development has been the realm of a very gendered realm that is like, this is women stuff, and it is not actual like real stuff. It is just like this other stuff. And so it's been most of the um, challenge of this process has been bringing it from there, which it should have never been, because I don't think there is such a thing as women's work. And bringing it to the realm of, no, this really is the place where you make your community successful. This is investments in innovation. This is investment in employment, in dignified employment. This is investment in better gender policy. This is investment in having better nutrition for your whole country. So this is not, I probably very inartfully tried to make a joke, but I love working with teachers. I was just, in fact, 2 days ago doing a training in Harlem with caregivers on social emotional development for a whole day. So there's that other part of my work, but for this global policy work in specifically, the main thrust of the work is, don't worry too much about what babies know about climate change. Worry a lot that they know the things that they need to know and that their social emotional development is healthy so that they can move on to a more resilient and more productive life.
Hi, thank you so
Sorry,
much.
before you go on, did that answer your question?
providing parents with resources or, yeah, I guess I'm here, yeah.
Okay, I'm glad I asked because again, this is the crux here. So no, the focus is making sure that governments use the tools of the nurturing care framework to build policies and practices that ensure that the health of young children are better taken care of, the nutrition of young children is better taken care of, they are safe and secure, that their parents are doing good work, and in that sense, yes, you support parents. And in all of these areas, you support parents. I work directly with the Office of Early Childhood Development in the Marshall Islands to really ensure that that office does well. But very little of what we talk about is climate change. A lot of what we talk about is, are people doing well? Are babies doing well? Are families able to support them? So yes, to answer your question, but we hardly ever talk about climate.
Thank you so much for the lovely talk. This was really, really interesting for me because it's so orthogonal to everything I think about. But earlier you had all the flags of the islands that are already investing in, I think, early childhood development in their policies. And I noticed that New Zealand and Australia were missing. I was just wondering if you might be able to elaborate a bit on that and what's happening there. Thank you.
That's interesting. Well, the compact, the PRC for ECD is only small island states. So it doesn't include Australia or New Zealand. But it's funny that you mentioned that because I was just in this microphone. I was just in Australia in May in their summit for early childhood development policy because the new government, the new prime minister in Australia has a very high, is giving priority to the issue of early childhood and the care of young children. And they invited me as the climate guy again. So we are now actively talking with the government of Australia, not just because they want to do it for Australia, but because there is a really high probability that Adelaide in Australia will be the host of COP31. And if that happens, they're going to highlight the issue of early childhood development as a driver of climate resilience, and that might be a real moment of a critical mass in terms of garnering global attention to this issue, because it's going to be a Pacific-facing summit if it happens there and not in Turkey. It's going to be using the example of what's being done in the Pacific Islands. So, and then New Zealand is a friend to the Pacific Islands, and they do a lot of things together, but we haven't gotten into a conversation with the New Zealand government directly. But they have eyes on all of this because every time we meet, they're there. It's just it's a very interesting question, and you know, sometimes it's easier to work in a country of 27,000 people. So, and that's why the Pacific becomes such a great laboratory for so many things. And then they can project that because they're a country like any other country.
Okay, I think, yeah, we have a couple spots open for dinner. So please go on Yale Connect and sign up for dinner, or find Lori. She'll make it super easy for you.
And if there is any topic that you want to expand on or talk about or consider doing research about, et cetera, please do reach out. Part of the reason I'm here is because I want to reconnect with the school. So, and what I do is so weird that it takes a little bit of introducing to get the discussion going. So if you're interested, please reach out.